All right, all welcome. For those of you not joining us today, we'll have a video set up for you so you can watch this later. Thank you so much for joining our series here, Phenomenal Science Teaching with me, Dr. Vic Sampson. So to get us kicked off here, let's do a couple little introductions here. I'll be a presenter. I'm Vic Sampson. I'm an associate professor of STEM education at the University of Texas. And moderating today will be Reed, who works at Argument-Driven Inquiry, and he'll be kind of monitoring questions and chats and putting links in the chat box for you to be using during this webinar. Quick reminder, if for attending these sessions, you can get continuing education unit credits. You get half a credit per session, and if you attend the entire series, that's a full 6 credits. So you can get that stuff for you to kind of help you out career-wise. When we're doing these webinars for this series, we're going to try to keep them short, full of information, but not take a lot of time because I know we're very busy with what's all going on. So from 4 to 4:20, we'll do the presentation about the topic. We'll have about 5 minutes or so for questions, depending on how many we're asking, and then we'll do about another 5 minutes for wrapping up announcements and kind of give you some updates on what will be happening next. With that, let's get started. What we want to talk today a little bit about is evaluating instructional materials and really thinking about using the right rubric, or thinking clearly about the kinds of criteria we're going to be using, or you should be using to choose what kind of materials that you'll be using in your school district or even in your classroom. The reason we wanted to talk about this is that we've got new TEKS going into effect. So we had all the way through, we had a series of new TEKS being adopted. Here's the high school ones, for example. Between 20 and 21, they were approved. New changes were made for those. In another webinar, we'll be talking about what those changes are, but they go into effect this coming year. Now, when we see a TEKS being adopted like this, it gives us an opportunity to make a change, right? So often we're kind of progressing along and kind of keeping up with what's the existing status quo. But when you have a big change like this is also a change to what we're supposed to be teaching. Is also a big chance to make a big change in your district or school as well. And what's nice about that is also the state also provides a proclamation which gives resources and funding that you need to make that change happen. So this is a great time to start thinking about that. So to start us off, I think the biggest thing when you're thinking about adopting these new teaching to these new standards and adopting instructional materials is, more than anything, you've got to start thinking about what kinds of learning experience you want your students in your district to have in science, right? So if you walk into a classroom and you saw teaching going on and learning happening from the kids, what kinds of things do you really want them to be doing in there? How do you want them to be spending their time? And I think it's a fundamental way to start thinking about what kinds of instructional materials you want to look at and how you're going to go about evaluating them. So if you want to post your answer in the chat, I'm not going to pause too long for that, but just give you a chance to kind of throw that out there, like what kinds of things that you're thinking about, or what kind of learning experiences would you love your students to see? Is it continuation of what's already happening in your school or district, or would you really like to see something new going on? Now, if you have that question answered, what we want teaching and learning to look like in our classroom, what do we want those instructional experiences to do? The next question is, how do we determine if the instructional materials that we're going to get into our teachers' hands, in front of our students, will it make it possible to provide those experiences? And I think this is a very important thing to think about, because the nature of your materials really shapes how kids interact, what kinds of things are valued, how teachers spend their time what they spend their time doing, how they support kids, what's valued in terms of learning, right? So the more these instructional materials are aligned to what you're hoping to see in the classroom, the better off you are. Now, that's not an easy task, since there's lots of things out there and lots of people are building different kinds of things, right? So one thing the state has done, the Texas Education Agency has done, is commission what they call the Texas Resource Review. And the Texas Resource Review lists out these kind of categories for looking at instructional materials and thinking about different indicators within these different categories and giving kind of a ranking of instructional materials of how well aligned they are with the indicators in here. And you can see the kind of categories as we get content, instructional approaches, and educator supports for use of these materials when they're coming up. So when you're really thinking about this, this is where the scores, when you can look at the Texas Resource Review website, you can start looking at scores that different materials have gone. You're looking at really at this middle section. Standard alignment is done, and that just says how many of the standards of the new standards are actually covered by the materials. And then this is designed to start looking at what happens when those materials are used on that way. So let me kind of break this down here for you a little bit. So one of the big categories that is focused on the content and the nature of instruction is something they are calling knowledge coherence. And there's two indicators around that. The first one is materials are designed to build knowledge systematically, coherently, and accurately. That's broken down into kind of 4 look-fors. One, that you've got vertical alignment that is designed for students to build and connect knowledge between grade levels. So what's going on in 5th grade is going to feed into 6th and feed into 7th, or biology is going to feed into chemistry. Materials are intentionally sequenced as scaffold learning allows for increased or deeper understanding. So the idea is that sequence should help kids learn and develop deeper understanding. Materials are clearly and accurately present the concepts, so there's nothing wrong in the materials. And then there's master requirements that say what kids should be doing to be able to demonstrate that they have achieved the different standards. The next indicator is thinking about, well, how does this provide components for teacher support, which is kind of curious because it's under kind of content instructional materials, and there's already a category for teacher or educator support in there, but it makes its way into this as well. So we have here material support teachers in understanding the horizontal and vertical alignment. So there's information for teachers about the alignment. There's explanations and examples of science concepts. So information about the content for teachers. And it explains why the instructional design of the program is used, right? So when you think of these, is on both of these indicators, they really focus on quite a bit on the needs of teachers. And we really don't see much of a focus on students, right? Like, what are students doing? What are they seeing? Even though that's really talking about kind of instruction in the guideline. Now, what is happening here is when you're scoring, you can get a total of 12 points for that. But they're only on either a 0, 3, 6 on each of those indicators. So you can get a top score of 12, a 9, a 6, or a 3 on this indicator. Now, the thing that starts wondering about is, does a high score on that indicator really help you decide if the instructional materials will create the learning experience, right? So that indicator tells you a lot about what support teachers are going to be getting, which is important, but does that allow you to really tell you about what students are going to be experiencing when they're engaged in the science, right? And if no, what else do you need to know? So feel free to throw a comment in the chat if you like to, if you want to interact with anybody else that's going on here, but that's just kind of a thought for you to think about as you're looking at these different materials. The next one you go down is something called productive struggle, right? And the definition of that indicator is materials providing opportunities for students to engage in productive struggle. So this seems to be much more of a switch toward the student sides of things. And it really has the guidance of what would meet that indicator would be things like students consistently sense making through reading, writing, thinking, and being scientists. And I think of that as students should be reading, writing, and thinking a lot. Next one is materials provide multiple opportunities for students to engage with grade level appropriate scientific texts. That really ends up focusing on, does kids read about the stuff that's at the grade level as defined by what's in the TEKS for that grade, right? So is this content only in 5th grade if you're teaching using 5th grade materials? And then materials provide multiple opportunities for students to engage in various written and graphic modes of communication to support students about concepts. Now, what's interesting about this, it's not really focusing on explaining or understanding the phenomenon around them, which is part of the kind of the instructional anchor of the new TEKS, but it's really communicating around concepts, right? Can you explain buoyancy? Can you explain relative density? Those kinds of things. And then finally, we kind of redefined productive struggle with productive struggle by saying material support students to act as scientists who can learn from engaging in phenomena in engineering process, make sense of concepts, and productively struggle. But it seems that really the way that's worded is more students are seeing phenomena, but focus on concepts and engage in productive struggle about those concepts, not so much about trying to explain events in the world that happens. Now, like I mentioned before, this indicator really seems to focus more on what students will be doing, which I think is a good thing. But when you start kind of breaking this down, when you look at the amount of points, you only have 4 on this indicator, right, versus the 12 of the last one. And you can only get a score of 100%, 50%, or 0% on this, right? So there's no kind of either you kind of all have it or you don't based on that. So something to think about when I'm bringing this up once again is, does this indicator make it possible for you to decide if the instructional materials will create the learning experience you want, right? Is that enough information for you to really distinguish between one set of materials versus another when it comes to kids' learning experiences? And that's for you to decide. Please throw a post in the chat if you would like to, or just kind of think about that question as we're moving through. Big takeaways from when you're looking at rubrics like this is, if you decide to use the TRR in evaluating materials, beware of 2 kinds of things. One is really the number of different indicators for each criterion and different weighting makes it different indicators that can skew results, right? So if the indicator has lots of different things to look for, it'll be worth more points, and there'll be more variation on scores that could be possible, right? A 75% or an 80% versus one that only has one indicator where you can only get 100% or 50%. So it really kind of skews what's going on with there and difficult to interpret scores. So make sure you dig into that. And then I think the other thing to really think about is, as you look through these criteria, and you can be the judge of this as well, is that they seem to be really highly aligned with what's valued in math and English language arts or in reading, rather than what's really valued in the teaching and learning of science. And I think that can be something that cause pause when we're really talking about instructional materials, because we can end up having a reading program instead of a science program on those kinds of things. Now, as an alternative to that, there's lots of folks have been doing a lot of work in terms of looking at how kids learn, whether you're in elementary or secondary grades, and trying to pull that together and put these recommendations for what kinds of things instructional material should look like. So recently here in 22, this report came out by the National Academies in Science and Engineering and Medicine, and it talks about the science and engineering in preschool through elementary grades. And what they did in this book, actually, we'll throw a link in here so you can actually read this here, completely free. Just download it or read it online. Either one, you can take a look at that. They'll go in the chat so you can see that. But what they do in this is they basically take all of the research that's been done over the last 20 years and boil it down to recommendations of what should be happening in classrooms to best support kids' learning, right? And they lay those out in the opening section of this book. So one of the things that I did is I went through this and put together a rubric that might be more useful. So if you're working with grades K through 5, you can start really focusing on science and what the research says, right? So you can think of this as kind of 2 indicators from this. There's the instruction materials supporting engagement in science and proficiency in science and engineering. And those are broke down based around those recommendations, right? So the idea that materials include interesting and phenomenon problems, and they leverage kids' natural curiosity, and they give kids opportunities to make decisions, right? Are those kinds of things happening in there? And with these kinds of indicators, you can start really thinking about, well, do I want to see this in my elementary classrooms? Same thing with curriculum and content integration. We're going to put a link in the chat here for you real quick where you can download this. We put this in a Google Drive. So you can just make a copy of it, use it, pass it around, do whatever you would like with it. But the hope is that you can use something like this to make your evaluation of instructional materials useful in terms of looking at what the research is saying. Similarly, in 2019, another report came out. The National Academies did another report, this time focusing on 6 through 12, talking about the importance of science and engineering in those grades. Once again, drew on all of the research that's been done in classrooms for the last 20 or so years. What does that say in terms of what should be happening in terms of teaching and learning? And then making recommendations of how we can turn that into practice, right? We'll put a link in here for you so you can download, or you can read this one online or download a free copy and pass it around. But the National Academies makes all of their publications free for everybody, so it's kind of a cool thing to be able to see. Anyway, that's right at the beginning. You can see these recommendations and conclusions right off the bat. So I did the same thing. I took these and I boiled it down into different indicators for grades 6 through 12. Based right off their recommendations. So, for example, for lessons, you can asking things about, does the phenomenon spark students' curiosity? And that's important for motivation, right? Do they have opportunities to engage in three-dimensional science and engineering, right? Those pieces are there. Assessment, is that a big part of what's going on, how assessment's being used, not just to categorize or rank kids or to motivate them to perform, but how can you use assessment to really help kids learn through giving them feedback or actually learning through the act of being assessed. So that's in the same Dropbox folder. We'll put that link up there for you as well so you can get that. Feel free to download, use, modify however you want. Like I mentioned, I also teach science methods courses at University of Texas. So one of the things that I have my students do is evaluate materials, right? So when you're looking for things that are aligned to teach a topic that you're directed to in the TEKS, and you find materials, how do those align? Do those really work well with what we know about how to help promote teaching and learning? So I basically took all of those recommendations and then blended them with some things that are really important here in Texas, such as TEKS coverage and things like that. So on this one, you can think about this as the indicators of being three-dimensional with the nature of the revised TEKS. We'll talk about that in another webinar that's coming up. Do they create meaningful and rigorous learning experiences for kids? So when you read these, do you get kids get opportunities to develop, critique, and refine ideas based on evidence, right? Once again, how's the assessment being used? And is there enough teacher support for teachers to be able to put these into good use, right? Which is an incredibly important kind of thing to think about. So those are all there. Feel free to use those. But as that's just extra tools for you. So big takeaways as you're leaving this webinar is really be clear about what you want learning experiences in science to look like before you start reviewing, right? Because the rubric you choose is going to lead to very different results. If you use any one of those rubrics and evaluate the same materials, they're going to score different. So what categories you use really makes a difference, right? And then as a check for yourself is just really make sure that the rubric focuses on what you think is the most important, right? And because we don't have opportunities to adopt new materials very often, and especially when there's extra funding from the state to do so, it's really important to take advantage of those opportunities to make the things happen that you really want to happen inside your classrooms. So that's the big takeaways from this. If there's any questions, we can post those in the chat here, and if not, we'll wrap this up for the day. All right, it doesn't sound like there's any questions. So we'll kind of wrap up for the day. We just did our first webinar in this series, which was evaluating instructional materials. Next Thursday, we'll be talking about an overview of the big changes in the new science TEKS. So what is really that is calling for now that they're going in. Often we don't have a chance to do a really big deep dive into those. We'll do that work for you. Then we'll talk about recurring themes and concepts in the new TEKS the week after that. And these webinars are all on Thursdays from 4 to 4:30 every week. You can register at that website right there. We'll drop that into the chat as well, so you can just click on that if you want to see that. In February, we'll be talking about science and engineering practices, phenomenon, 3D instruction, 3D assessment, And how do you introduce a phenomenon later on after that? Once again, 4 to 4:30 on Thursdays. And then in March, we're going to be talking about fostering learning, promoting and supporting student talk. We'll do it twice because there's so much to talk about on that. And then end up our last webinar in this series with supporting emerging multilingual learners in science. So please join us, pass this information around. Like I said, you can get all sorts. People can get the continuing education unit credits for that. And we try to break these down so they're quick, short, and get the information you need and can keep going. Also, just a quick reminder of tomorrow, we have our Make a Change grant information session number 2. So we'll be talking about, we're offering grants to schools and school districts this year like we did last year. So we're going to be talking about that program, how to apply, project requirements, all that kind of stuff. That's tomorrow at 4 o'clock. We'll also be doing recordings of that, so all you have to do is register and we will send you the video if you can't make it during that time. Last thing to also do is if you're thinking about more professional learning during the summer months, we are doing 2 facilitator institutes this year. So one in June and one in July. If you'd like to know a little bit more about that information, we'll drop a link in the chat so you can see where that is if you want to learn about what those are doing, looking like, and what we're doing for those. As always, thank you so much for attending and spend some time to learn about phenomenal science teaching. You can follow us on any of these socials, and thank you so much and have a great afternoon.